It's finally time to put this transmission back together. So do a quick walk around here. It's been sandblasted, primed, and painted. Chased all the threads. Had to drill out and tap a couple of the holes on top here, 2 of them. But this is the transmission out of my tractor, and the guts we're going to put in here is out of the parts tractor. Alright, we'll do a quick go over the rest of the parts. Here's everything laid out, except for bolts. Start off on the input shaft side. We got an input shaft seal. This will be a National 471-765. It's a 1.187 shaft, 2-inch outside diameter. We got the retainer for the seal, and this also holds in the race. We got the shims to go between the retainer and the case to adjust the bearing preload. And we have 3rd gear, 2nd gear, and 1st gear on the input shaft side. Now these are the parts tractor. If you remember from the teardown video, the ones that came out of this one were pretty rough, but these are got a little bit of wear on them, but they're not too bad. It's nothing like the other one. Then we have the rear bearing. Then we have the rear input shaft bearing, which is going to sit right about here. Over here we got a reverse idler. Bearings for that. And the pin that it rides on. Now if we start on the output shaft, that's the cover plate. We have the shaft itself. Big bearing on the end with the pinion. Got a nut that holds the bearing in place. This is a spring washer, which is supposed to help keep the right preload. It's still a little bit wavy, so I think we're going to be good there. We'll find out when we go to put it in. We have a thrust washer, which rides against this gear here. This is going to be 3rd gear, 2nd gear, and 1st gear. Our bearing race that goes on the outside. I guess I didn't go over the input shaft very much here, so I'll backtrack for a second. Got the front input bearing. There's a little bit of wear in the splines here, but it's not horrible. It's way better than the other transmission I have. The only thing missing here is a spacer that would go in between. Let's see which 2. Actually, it goes in between these 2. So this one would ride here. This one would ride about here, and there'd be a spacer in between. If you remember my teardown video, had a whole lot of in play on this shaft. It would move in and out about a 1/4 inch. Well, that spacer was worn down. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to assemble this shaft in the transmission case, then measure the gap to see how big of a spacer I need to make, and I'll make a spacer for it. So that's where we're at right now. Okay, first step is I need to install the rear input shaft race. And there's already a snap ring in place. It will stop it from going too far. There we go. So we're going to put our race in there. Unfortunately, I do not have the correct installer for this size race. It was in the kit, but for some reason it's missing. So we're going to go with one a tad big, and then I'll turn it over to seat it fully. Hopefully this will straighten it up. We might have to regroup here. We'll see. Really hard working around this camera. Sure, you can't see anything with my hand in the way. A little bit on the bottom, aren't we? I could favor that bottom edge a little bit and straighten it up. I think that's all the way in, but we'll double check this way. Yeah, that's sound. Yeah, I don't like using that wrong size adapter, but it's aluminum on hardened steel, so it shouldn't be too bad for it. And looking at the back side, it looks fine. There's one more part to install on this, though. There's an oil splash shield. Goes on the other side of that race. Let me move the camera here and we'll take a look where it goes. Just going to mount there. It's pretty much impossible for me to put this in place with the camera in the way, so I'm going to install it and then show you what it looks like. Alright, should look something like this installed. What I believe that thing does essentially is it keeps oil from running straight out of the bearing. Holds a little bit in there so it can build up. So next up, we will slide the shaft in place through all the gears. So the order we do is third, second, and spacer. So this is our third gear. Second gear. And then we would normally have our spacer, but we got to measure for that. And you can see here where that spacer chewed this up pretty good. This will be our third gear. Then we're going to have a bearing. Okay, wouldn't have slid together that close if there was a spacer there, but we can go with this. Next up, we have the race. Then I'm going to use 3 shims and this retainer. And once to do that, measure what it is, cut the spacer, and remove shims as needed to get the preload right. We're not going to worry about sealing these until we do final assembly. Alright, now that we have the shaft in, what we need to do is there needs to be a spacer in this section that holds these 2 gears apart. What happened to cause this shaft to have end play is the gears slid together. You can see a little bit of roughness on first gear there. I didn't notice before. A couple of them. Take a look at my other one just to see where it's at. Or I got them mixed up. Okay, so anyway, the spacer in here holds these two apart, so when you set the bearing preload and that spacer wore down, right now, it moves all over the place because there's no spacer at all. But the whole idea here, what I need to do is I need to spread that apart and then measure it. Okay, what I'm going to do is spread these apart with these. I'm going to see what kind of gap I have in between there. Spread them tight and then make sure I have no end play. I really need 4 hands to do this. I'm looking for just the right fit. There we go. Okay, now I will take a micrometer and measure this. That will tell me how wide my spacer needs to be. Well, it's at micrometer, but the caliper was closer. 1.681. Make sure we're zeroed. Oh, that's not zero. Need the battery. This thing's flashing. .683. And I'm going to double check to make sure the adjustment in this didn't change. So I'll do it one more time, make sure it fits the same. Yeah. All right. Okay, so I'll take this back apart and make a spacer. One more thing before I take it back apart. Show you close up of this gear. Apparently I put the wrong one in my stack. That one was the worn one. On the bottom edge there you can see the teeth. They're pretty worn. So what I'm going to do off camera, so I will install this good one and then remeasure to make sure my measurement's the same. Actually, what I'll do is probably once I remove it, I'll take my caliper and make sure this one is the same length as that one and not worn at all, and it'll be fine. Alright, there we go. Our spacer's complete. Originally, it looked like this. Boarded out. Cleaned it up a little on the outside. It's only aluminum, but if this was a tractor I was going to use hard, I would probably make it out of steel. Although even this aluminum is, at the thickness it is way stronger than the sheet metal piece they had in there. So I don't think I'll get any issues with this. Next step, let's put it all together and adjust the bearing preload. In this case, the shop manual doesn't really call for an actual preload number. What it calls for is remove shims until there's no more slack in the bearings. Most modern transmissions with tapered roller bearings like this, there would be a preload. So you take your gap measurement and you subtract from it a little bit, a couple thousandths, to put tension on the bearings. So we'll just go by the shop manual that's lasted 100 years and go from there. But we'll try to get it where there might be a minimal preload, but the big key here is no slack in the shaft. Alright, time to remove this shaft and put it all back together with the spacer. To get this race out, I have to tap on the back of the shaft, force it out, and then the race will fly out and land on the floor. So I put this there to stop it. I won't have to pick it up. Yeah, we're getting there. Sure you can't see much of what's going on here with my hand in the way, but so technically we don't have to take it all the way out. Set my spacer on there, and my other, I'm not going to use this first gear. This one's chewed up. I think that one got in the pile by mistake, but this is the one I want to use. Yeah, that didn't work. I believe I'm going to have my bearing already in there. Okay, so you couldn't see what was going on, but I had to place the bearing in the hole first to have room. So one thing I did not account for when I made that sleeve is I did not think it would be in the way for any of the gears shifting. It is quite possible. Well, no, we're going to clear it. The gear that engages first gear here, it will definitely clear that before it moves over. Okay, next step, we are going to install the race and everything on the front. The race goes in first. This mallet I'm using is pretty soft, so it's taking a bit. There we go. I'm going to start with 3 shims. See if it'll take up all the slack. Our dot here goes down. If 3 shims do not do it, I'll remove one. If it's too tight, I'll have to go dig up an extra shim out of the parts bucket from the other transmission. I believe this had 2 on it. I don't remember off the top of my head. Be real careful not to break this. Why are we locked up? No, just because we're slid forward. Once it goes back, it'll be fine. It was pulled forward and the gear was hitting there. It's been fine. Still have a little bit of in play there. Good news is this part's easy. We don't have to deal with the ray. I'll just remove a shim and tighten it back down. Let's see if that's enough. I don't know how long we were driving it with the in play it had before. I mean, that was at least 1/8 of an inch. I didn't actually measure it, but going from memory. Alright, we spin good. We have no play at all. No up and down. No side to side. Still not tight enough though, because our gears have some slack in them. I'm going to take one more shim out, see if that clears that up. Yeah, so I know you couldn't see very well there, but there's not much play in the shaft. But I could still spin that spacer by hand, which tells me it was not quite right. Alright. I actually think we even spin better now. It's a lot smoother. No play in and out or up and down. Our gears are good and tight. That shim in the middle, or spacer in the middle, is good and tight. I think that's what we're going for. Alright, so technically on this bearing retainer here, I need to install the seal and put some kind of sealant on that shim that's left. I am not going to do that right now. I can do that at any point, so I'm going to go ahead and assemble it, because I don't know if I end up needing to take it back apart for some reason. Could be I'm doing this in the wrong order and I'll need to take it out to put this output shaft in, or something unforeseen like that. So I did tell you one thing I forgot to do right off the bat. I realized I did not put in a reverse gear idler in the back. I guess I should do that before I go any further, because I definitely can't do it once I put the output shaft in there. I'm hoping I can get it to fit in there. It looks like it might not. See if this thing can even fit in the hole. No. Oh man. I'm gonna have to take it all back apart. At least I have my preload spacing correct at this point. I'll go ahead and do this off camera. I won't worry about it here. So I'll pull this shaft out and then we will come back and install the reverse idler. I took it back apart and we will put in the reverse idler at this point. This gear will essentially go up here, and a pin will come in from the backside and hold it in place. I'll try to reposition the camera where you can see as much of that as possible. Okay, at this point we're looking through the front of the case, through the hole that the input shaft goes through. There's a couple things we need to do. There's a pin that goes to the backside to hold it, and inside of the gear there will be a pair of these bearings. But I'll have both of these bearings inside the gear when I place it in there. The way this sits, the larger of the two gears will go towards the front. Then I will push the pin through it. Can't really see what's going on here. Kind of guide it in there and do it by feel. Okay. That's in place. I'm going to show you what's on the back side. So on the back side here, there's a pin. That will have a piece of flat bar in it. Well, I'll show you that here in a second. Okay, this is the piece that holds it in place. This piece will slide into a groove. Here, I gotta rotate it a little bit. Then this bolt goes in place. And that bolt will stop the pin from sliding out and rotating. Go ahead and torque this down. Okay, now we're back to where I need to install the input shaft. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in here this last time off of camera. Okay, we're back where we should be. Input shaft is installed. Reverse idler is installed. But I ran into a big hiccup I had to take care of off camera. Had my nice spacer there. But I did not account for the reverse idler gear being so close to the input shaft. So I had to put it on the lathe and cut it. Make room for it. So now it's a lot thinner there. I see why they used a sheet metal spacer. I'm a little worried about that being aluminum now that it's this thin. That noise you hear, if my mic's not cutting it out, is just the backlash in this gear, which is nothing. It's pretty silent. Alright. I'm going to take a break at this point, walk away, come back and do the input shaft, or output shaft, I should say, another time. Okay, so the input shaft is installed. The reverse gear idler is installed. Now it's time to install the output shaft. First step on that is to install this race, this lower hole. We've got to do it from the back side. Okay, we're going in a little crooked, so I need to straighten it up. There we go. I guess you couldn't see it because I moved the transmission. But this is the race I installed. The next part to install is going to be the output shaft with the pinion, and it's going to slide into the rear of the housing towards the front through all the gears. Alright, let's see if I can do this with the camera and light and everything in the way. First gear it's going to go through, this first gear. Then we're going to have second. And third. Second gear is giving me some trouble here. There we go. Okay, inside of here, Probably barely see it. You see this gear free spins on the shaft. So there is a thrust washer that goes against that. I'm just realizing I forgot to install the race on this side. That's kind of important. Let me back this shaft up a little bit and do that. I'm going to temporarily start the nut on here so all the gears don't fall off while I'm shaking the transmission. Dang it, I paused the video to go gather up tools to knock that race in and forgot to hit record. Either way, it's the same as any other race, so you didn't miss much there. Okay, back to where we were. We already installed this thrust washer. Now there is a washer that is wavy, designed to take up the gaps like a spring washer. Then we got the bearing. So this whole time I'm holding the shaft into the transmission from the rear. Not wanting to destroy this bearing, so I'm hoping it goes a little easier than that. Ideally, I'd have somebody hold this in from the rear, and I put a piece of pipe or something over that and tap it on. But if I can get a thread or two showing, I'll be fine. There we go. Alright, this nut's 1 3/8 inches. But for some reason, now I can't find the socket for it. So we're going to go with an adjustable wrench at the moment. At least to get this thing close enough to keep rolling. Now the big trick is stopping this from turning. What I'm going to try is a small block of wood wedged into the gears and see if that does anything for me. Theoretically, this block of wood right here should be fine. So as this nut pulls these two bearings closer together into the taper of the race, it's going to take up all the end play. Right now, let's see if I can. Yeah, you can see. Still got a good ways to go. And we're going to turn it, tighten it down until it gets a little tight to turn the shaft, and then loosen it a little. We want it to spin freely with no play. Still got a little bit. I don't know how much of this is showing up on this camera with my hand in the way, but Just felt like it got tight. There's no play either direction. To me, it feels a little bit like it's pretty tight there. You know what I was just realizing? Could have just put this into 2 gears at once. It's just as good as that block of wood. My mind was slipping there. Yes, we're pretty tight now. Let's go past. Try to get this in a neutral. Spins really well. I think I'm going to leave it there. There's no slack. Spins great. Okay, now a quick test. Just make sure our races are seated and we have nothing binding up. We're going to tap it using a brass hammer. I don't want to tear up my threads. And I'm going to do the same thing from the other side. Except with a brass punch because I can't reach it with a hammer. Zero play. We are good. Okay, last step. You lock it into 2 gears at once here. So the last step is to pin this nut in so it doesn't come loose. Doesn't take much. Scared me for a second, it didn't turn. Okay, now we're neutral. They all spin great. No slack. Let's go through the gears here real quick. Okay, input shaft on top if we want to go into first gear. Slide that over. This little gear turn in the big gear. We're in first gear. If you want to go to second gear, we're going to slide this one over. To the mid-size gear, turning the mid-size on the bottom shaft. Want to go into third gear. This gear engages the third gear on the bottom shaft and locks it to it, because normally this bottom gear just free spins. Now we're in third gear. If we want to go in reverse, see in the very back you see the reverse idler gear. Back here, it's always engaged on the first gear here. Put it this way. Oops, I accidentally slid that one. Now we're in reverse. Reverse, first. Both shafts turn the same direction in reverse. Opposite direction any forward gear. Alright, there is a cap that goes over this front half here. But I'm not going to do that until I get everything together and go to put the seal in and do everything on the front. Okay, what I want to do next is put the shifter in place, the shift housing on the side. I guess fork assembly is probably the name for it. And see how it shifts. And I'm going to have to look at the overshift washers and see if they're in the right place on that shift assembly. They're pretty, I don't know how to tell. There's no shop manual instructions at all on those washer adjustments. So we'll play it by ear, see how it goes. I might run a bore scope up and through the drain hole to see it better and see if I could tell if something's going on. Stay tuned. Here's our shift assembly all wrapped up. We went through this in another video. Should have just grabbed a razor blade. Alright. Knocking stuff over. There we go. It's all ready. The overshift washers I'm talking about, this one only had one for this gear train, but the housing that I'm using actually had two. So we'll see how it goes. So first off, I need everything to be in neutral. And these two forks should engage the slots on either side of those gears. Now, this is not going to be final assembly. Final assembly, I'm going to oil everything up in there so it doesn't corrode away while it's sitting and waiting to be run. I'm not going to worry about that third one because it's just a flathead. I'm going to tighten them up, but not super tight. These won't be the final bolts I use. The bolts I'm going to put in here before I paint it are already cleaned up and primed. And I'll do touch up on all the exterior visible bolts. But where we're at so far. Now let's get a shifter we could drop down in there. Here's our shifter assembly. This is a bushing I'm working on to take up some slack. This particular one is 3D printed. I won't be using 3D printed permanent, but just to get the size right and the right shape and everything, then I'll machine one out of Delrin. I don't need that at the moment. Alright, we got neutral. First. Reverse. Second. Third. Okay. We got first. Reverse. Second. Third. Okay, so if I push on it towards third gear more, the shaft gets stiff. If I push on it towards second, it does not. Push on it towards first, it does not. Push on it towards reverse, it does not. So what I gather from that, and I may or may not be correct, is there's a little bit of spring there once I'm in the detent in third. If I push it a tad farther, it's hard to turn the shaft. I can tell the fork is pressing itself against the gear. So I'm going to leave it in third, take this plate back off, and see if that is an area where I can add one of those overshift washers. And if I could add it there and it'll help, that might eliminate that issue. It's not really an issue for the most part because the detent holds it where it's supposed to be. But if I can adjust it and make it a little better, I'll do it. Okay, looking at the fork assembly. This is our fork that's over this way for third gear. And if I put a spacer there, that's not going to change anything. So we're going with it as is. That's how it was built. We'll ride with it. Next step is going to be the differential installation. Found some issues with my differential while I was rinsing it off one last time. There's a thrust washer here for the spider gears. That is not where it needs to be. Also got a lot of play there. So I'm going to make a video on tearing this apart. I got the other one. We'll see which one's best. I'd like to use this one if possible because the output shaft I'm using was already mated to this gear, so that would be better. But it looks like I need to drill that hole out where it's peened in and drive the pin out to get it apart. It doesn't have a screw or a bolt, so we'll go with that for another video. But for now, I'll go ahead and complete the transmission half of the assembly on this and do the differential as another video. One more thing to point out I did off camera. I glued a magnet in the bottom of the transmission case to collect any steel debris that may accumulate over time. Okay, all I did at this point was lay the transmission over on its side so I could get a little bit of oil on all the gears and steel inside so it doesn't corrode up. I'm going to go ahead and seal this cover and install the shift forks. Trying to get just enough of this to seal it well, but not have too much squish going into all the bits and pieces. And whatever squishes out, we trim off after it's dry. So not a big deal. That way you don't see it on the outside and it doesn't make it look ugly. We've got the forks in neutral, transmission's in neutral. Try to get you to see as much as you can here. Let me move the camera. Like I said, these aren't going to be the final screws or final bolts. Once this RTV dries later on, I'll pull these out one at a time and replace them with the finals. Before I go too far with this, though, I want to make sure I still shift. I want to make sure the forks are right. Yep, we're good. We're almost there. Next step is put this cover on. Now, I want to be very careful doing this with RTV because I do not want the RTV to squish into the bearing. So I'm going to put a little on the edge and see how that goes. Okay, so I have a little bit around the edge. Hopefully it doesn't squish in too much. The other thing you need to be sure of is these bolts actually go all the way through and the threads can leak. So you'll want to make sure you put a little bit of sealant on the threads themselves. Man, I made a mess of this. I got it all over the place. At least this part's hidden inside of the fork tube. I should have figured out which side was up first. Dang. 3 tries? Alright, last steps for sealing up this transmission side. I forgot to hit record when I installed the seal, but press the seal into the housing. Clean the housing up real good with some brake cleaner. There's no oil residue. And I'm going to use copper coat in between the shims. Alright, so this part's a little tricky. We need to pick it up. We need to coat the other side without touching anything. Alright, it's a little boogered up there. I want to touch it up. Okay, back to the transmission. Want to be sure to get grease on the shaft where the seal rides. Also put a little bit of grease within the lip of the seal. Alright, time for the 3 bolts. These bolts go all the way through also, so you want to be sure you put a little bit of sealant on the threads. Alright, just to show you something, I tried a new method on my RTV stuff. I was letting this dry and then peel off. But while it's still wet, if I take a good cloth rag and wipe it down and buff it, it goes away. So I'll probably do that from now on. Here's where we're at so far. The only thing left on the transmission side is the shifter. Once I get that differential problem squared away, we'll install the differential and set the bearing, preload, and backlash. Okay, started recording this and realized my headset wasn't even on. So we're going to install the shifter at this point. Got it greased up real good. Then the spacer I talked about a little bit earlier, I 3D printed. What it does is it rides on top of here. Probably not necessary. The little metal one it had held it in place, but the issue is it had a whole lot of play up and down, and I wanted it to fit tighter. So we're going to try to do that. And if this one works out dimension-wise, I'll go ahead and machine one on my lathe out of Delrin where it'll be better. Okay, so there's a little notch here, which probably helps a little bit during assembly. It helps more during disassembly. I'm going to try to do this without scratching up my paint. This is a very tight clip, by the way. This needle nose vice grip's holding part of it in place. And maybe I could work it down. Well, that seems to be the trick. Okay, so it does feel there's no play in it. It feels a tad stiff. So what that tells me, when I make the replacement at a Delrin, it just needs to be a little bit shorter. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to go ahead and install the finishing touches. And to top it off, a new knob. Alright, first, reverse, second, third. Alright, there we go. So that completes the transmission half. Once I figure out what's going on with that differential, we'll install the differential and set the preload and backlash. But transmission's mostly done. I'd say 3/4 done. We did the hard part. See you next time.